Hi, this is Dr. Carl Goldkamp. If you're interested in learning about the ketogenic diet like I was, to save my own life, then this is probably the podcast for you. 8 years ago, I knew nothing about it. 6 years ago, it saved my life. 3 years ago, I started researching and talking with some of the authorities in the field and attending medical conferences about this to understand why and how keto so dramatically changed my and my wife's Judy's lives. The purpose of this podcast is to share our journey of discoveries with you and understanding how keto is so effective in improving so many different conditions, from obesity, epilepsy, diabetes, infertility, MS, Alzheimer's, heart disease, to name a few. So take a step away from all the hype you've probably heard and roll up your sleeves with me and join me weekly to explore this living miracle that anyone can access. We'll talk science, we'll talk food. We'll explore its history and evolution to today, which is that the sheer wonder of the ketogenic way of eating has changed untold number of lives, unlike anything before it. And in case I forget to mention it, please join our Facebook group, Keto Naturopath. Hi, this is Dr. Goldkamp, and welcome back for another episode of the Keto Naturopath. Today, it may be over your head and talking about too many details, and sometimes I try to keep it, historic. Sometimes I try to keep it about implementation. We're going to go over the macros today. We're going to go over the quality of food. Sometimes I have somebody I can interview that I've had to study for a week on their particular focus, topic, and experience and authority to make it for an interesting interview. But today, I want to compare some labs, big picture. So I want you to come away with some concepts. And I'm going to pretend you're like one of the people in our groups, one of our clients, if you will. And one of the things I impose on them, there's a lot of work that they have to do. There's a lot of testing we do up front, so we get that information that comes back in drips and dribbles, throughout the subsequent 90 days. But they're required to keep their daily input of the foods they eat on chronometer. So I get to check their macros out, and we've set them up so they know the hoops they have to go through. And then we meet weekly to hear what issues come up and what we can do to help, whether it's food or whatever. So today I wanted to go over some of the discoveries that I had in terms of labs, because as I've evolved with coaching others, it's gone from first free and no labs. We're just going to talk about certain things. And even then, it was a group of about 15, and they wanted labs. It was free, and I didn't want to tie up that much of my time, but labs are fun to talk about. Then we had a small group, started doing some labs, and another group, more labs. And now it's evolved that this last group did, pretty much a collective total of about $1,500 to $2,000 worth of labs, and it broke down to a blood work, a panel that I created, some basic and some not. And there's some really interesting discoveries across the board, and I've used this as my standard panel now. So I see, clients come in apart from any particular program we're doing, simply to go through maybe a 6-appointment coaching. And I strongly suggest that not only do they document their data, their food, on chronometer like the others had to do, but at least do this panel, and I'll show them why they might be interested in doing a hormone panel or intracellular nutrition panel, or to look at their genome. So just on the idea of looking at what I call their blood work, their basic panel, they go to a Quest lab called Ulta Lab, and they get this done. It's really interesting, some conclusions to come up with. So in a group now that is not all the same group, about 10 total that have done at least this lab, here's what I've come up with that I've seen as pretty consistent results, is that what I find, now starting at the top, and I'm not going to go, if I blind you with some of these names of these tests, don't go there in your mind. I'm not trying to be savvy or technical or say, hey, I'm going to hit this. I'm trying to, and this is the thing that I foist on the people who's a client or not. It's like, you're going to understand a little bit of lab work. Don't go dumb. Don't go vacant, because really the onus is on you to understand some of this. Maybe not the esoteric, but some of the basic work, so that's when you go to your doctor, you're going to have a more intelligent conversation because you're going to bring some knowledge that you know to that conversation. And that's the point. You're going to use your physicians as coaches, not have them tell you what to do. I'm not trying to start a rebellion. I'm trying to initiate some education in you so you can be a little more savvy, comfortable with knowing these things. Whether or not you were a biology student or a pre-med or whatever. Okay, I just find it all very fascinating because I don't see it as all that complicated. I really don't. Once you get over just knowing labs, it's not that complicated. So the first thing is, the cheapest test that is kind of a universal test is called the CBC, Complete Blood Chemistry. I don't know what they consider complete about it, but that's what it's called. It's all of $10, and you get a lot of information for this $10. So that's like a big bang for your buck. So on that, we get to look at your white blood cells and your red blood cells and various ratios, and it allows us to draw certain conclusions that we then can follow up with other labs. So it's very fascinating. So the first thing that I am not going to go through every lab and every line of CBC, but I'm going to pull out just two that I think are pretty interesting. And that is, it's a ratio of what they call neutrophils to lymphocyte. We use, and you want a 2-to-1 or better. Neutrophils are to lymphocytes. Both are a type of white blood cell. So when you have your RBC, white blood count, you have neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, basophils, etc. So we're just comparing two because there's now enough research on this. It says if you compare your neutrophil numbers, and you can do percent too, neutrophil numbers to your lymphocyte numbers, and if it's less than a 2-to-1 ratio of neutrophils over lymphocytes, that this person is probably having an immune challenge. So what does an immune challenge mean? Is it he's having a cold, he just has a flu, or is there cancer brewing in the distance? You don't know. I mean, you just don't know what that is, and both of those qualify. You also could see that a person could be immune challenged if they've been under a lot of stress at work for a long period of time. So it just means that, the fight is being lost a little bit. It's just being very strenuous and they're just not quite making it. So 75% of the people that had this lab who were at least 100 pounds overweight, and the majority were men in this particular case, didn't make it. They had a poor lab. It means they were immune challenged. They did not have a check that list, a nice clean immune system. No, they were struggling. There was a degree of struggle. It wasn't vast. They were just, for instance, they were 1.7 as opposed to 2-to-1. So they were just under, but still it's significant. So they're struggling with something. And so what is also interesting when I slide over on the spreadsheet, because I keep everybody on this kind of collective spreadsheet and you can hide everybody's names from each other so all that information is shared, or hide columns or rows or whatever, is that I find that there's a number of people that came in strictly about, I'm going to do keto, not for weight loss, but to support my immune system. Well, they actually didn't have this immune problem. They actually did not have the neutrophil to lymphocyte issue, designating that there's a struggle going on. They had better numbers. They had other issues. We'll get to that. But anyways, so neutrophil over lymphocytes, say across the board, except for one person, was challenged, was immune challenged. And the picture I'm trying to present to you is that, remember, the main issue that they came to see me was weight loss, and keto wasn't working for them, and weight loss wasn't working for them, and they're sick and tired of being sick and tired. They knew that they are not this fat guy or this fat woman, and they wanted to change it. So they're willing to look deeper. That's the whole motivation here. Okay, then. So we got that out of the way. So that was a little bit, some people would raise their eyebrows saying kind of makes sense. There's kind of what I call an invisible obstacle to losing weight when you see these other things going on. At the same time, you can say when you are grossly overweight, you have immunologically challenged your whole body, your whole metabolism. So you've put a weight. If you want to sort of see this weight as Atlas holding up the earth, well, Atlas is starting not to be able to shrug anymore, right? He's just starting to sink. That's your immune system sinking under the burden of excess weight. So now we're going to look at these other things that happen because of excess weight. And it happens to everybody slightly differently. So we're looking for commonalities. Okay, the next thing, and perhaps I should have started with this, it's a fairly obvious. I looked for out of range fasting insulin and out of range fasting glucose. So only one of these people was diabetic. So of course they're going to have very out of range glucose and very out of range insulin. However, the other 9 weren't expecting that. You know, they had borderline high glucose by a couple of points out, maybe 10 points out of range, but not diabetic. So diabetic would have to be 126 or higher. So they weren't that high. Highest was 118. The lowest was 100. Within range is, depending what lab you go to, 98, 99. So they're just a little bit from 1 to 18 points out. But all of them had out of range insulin by a considerable amount. So not just by a little bit. So what that shows is that a while ago when they started gaining weight is that their pancreas was losing, another part of their body that was losing the fight. Their pancreas was pumping out a lot more insulin to keep their glucose somewhat normal, but it was losing the fight. A couple of things. When I say losing fight, what it means it's been pumping out more and more and more insulin, but this insulin is becoming less and less effective. Another way of saying less effective is to say their insulin is less glucose sensitive, or they're losing insulin sensitivity, or now it's sort of just thrown into the garbage can reference of insulin resistance. The insulin is less effective. And so they pump out more and more and more of it. And eventually what happens is that you actually do get burnout in the pancreas, and the beta cells, which is the factory of insulin in the pancreas, start to flame out. They die. And then you're really in a problem, because then you start running out of insulin, and then you have to start taking exogenous insulin. So they're all out of range, and that was new to them. They're going, say what? I'm just here for weight loss. I thought this would be interesting to take a look at blood work. Now they're going, you're saying that actually I'm pre-diabetic, or borderline diabetic? Never been told that before. My doctor just said my glucose was a little bit out of range. So that's a big deal, and I hope you guys all pick that up. And while I think of it, I got Quest Labs through Ulta to offer a code in which you can get a great discount to go get fasting glucose and fasting insulin. I'll put the code as a link. So what you do is you just hit that code. It goes into our lab account, if you will. So we have a lab account called Keto Naturopath. So it pops in there, and you then get a requisition. I don't have to know about it. No other doctor has to know about it. That's what Ulta Labs or Quest is being smart about. They're opening it up to everybody. That you can just go down to the nearest Ulta Labs, and you can look online to see where the location is closest to you. For us, it's about 30 minutes away. So you go down and you have this done. It'll probably take you all of 5 minutes. And you probably have to pay, I think the total there was $20, and I think you have to pay a maximum $8 phlebotomy, blood draw fee. Highly worth doing it. So you'll have your fasting lab, fasting glucose, and that will give you an insight that you probably had never seen before, unless you are diabetic. Okay, so that was impressive. So that means these guys are struggling with a thing called glucotoxicity, meaning their glucose is becoming more toxic. They're getting pancreas atrophy, fatigue, and you could even guess, since there's nothing to do with labs, that their liver is becoming fatty. Now, the interesting thing is we do a liver panel on this as well. All their liver panels are normal. So nobody had a liver panel problem. But I would guess if we did a scan, you could see that their liver is getting fattier. I could almost guarantee that to happen. So you don't need to see liver enzymes liver blood work to be problematic for your liver to start being fatty. It will eventually start showing up lab-wise. Okay, what else did we see? We saw 3/4 of everybody had elevated triglycerides and had decreased HDL. And you put those two together, that's also a way of looking at insulin resistance, kind of a natural progression. It also is setting up for cardiovascular disease. It's also setting up for cerebral vascular problems like vascular dementia, when you don't get the blood to your brain that you should, and or you're not getting enough, you're certainly not getting any ketones, and you're not getting enough glucose because your brain, when your glucose is high long enough, your brain cells start shutting down, become less sensitive to glucose. Your insulin has gone higher and higher and higher and higher in your brain, just like it has in the body. And so that tends to shut down your brain cells from taking in glucose. So that's a problem. So from having sustained high elevators of glucose, ironically, the brain cells are getting less glucose because you've driven them to be less sensitive. The answer to that, obviously, is a ketogenic diet in which the brain cells actually prefer to feed on ketones. And once you get fat adapted, that's where the whole mental clarity comes in. Right? People go, "Oh, my mental clarity, I'm as smart as Einstein now." It really comes from the fact that you're now started to transition to burning ketones, and the ketones are feeding your brain cells, and you actually are getting mental clarity. Okay, pretty cool, huh? And so the last thing, and this was a surprise, I didn't have this on my kind of wall expectations. It's a test called homocysteine. Homocysteine. You can look that up in Google, but what that homocysteine means, it's probably been popular for the last 20 years. Not that it's unpopular now, it's becoming more of an issue, but it's no longer a novel issue or a novel test. It has to do, again, with cardiovascular problems and cerebral vascular problems. It is a kind of gums things up. It's the beginning of not the fibrillary tangles in your brain, but other residues that are kind of a precursor to that. And so one of the assignments is when people see elevated homocysteine is they have to get their homocysteine down. And in order to get it down in the brain, you use certain supplements. In order to get it down in the body, you use other supplements. If anybody's open to understanding that, I don't want to go too far, but in the brain, methylfolate, which is out there now, that seems to be the most effective way of getting homocysteine down in the brain. And in the rest of the body, a thing called trimethylglycine or beta-ine, two different names for the same thing, gets your homocysteine down. That's a big deal. So that minimizes your risk of cardiovascular, minimizes your risk of cerebral vascular. That's a big deal. But what that also implies, the whole elevated homocysteine, there's a big word behind that called methylation, and there's a whole methylation system, ecosystem, that gets into your genomes. You know, certain enzymes that help convert homocysteine to methionine. I'm not going to get into it because it's hard to visualize. I used to lecture on this back in 2007 to 9, I think it was. And times haven't changed. Still the same issue. So those are some things you can do, but why is it some people, why is it we see with all these people that are overweight, and I'm speaking specifically of the group that I've looked at, why do they all have elevated homocysteine? It's because of the elevated insulin. If you were to point to something, elevated glucose caused the elevated insulin. The elevated insulin then starts causing other things. If you're a man with all that, it's going to start dropping your testosterone. If you're a woman, it causes other situations, but it's basically the insulin that leads on to being kind of lead into estrogen dominance and a few other things. I think it lead into PCOS if you're premenopausal. Interesting. So I want to give you this vocabulary both of labs and the context of these labs that I would now say my profile of a person who has 100 pounds to lose is expect elevated homocysteine. And in part, that elevated homocysteine came through a bad diet. You can bet anybody who's 100 pounds overweight was not eating whole foods. They were high on processed foods. So that means, I don't mean high as in high on drugs. I mean, they had a high percentage in their diet of processed foods. So when you start taking out the processed foods and put in new processed foods, that change alone, forget about calories and macros and everything else. So if they're eating sandwich meat and you put them on liver and steak, chicken, salmon, you're going to see a change in their blood work in a good way. If you see, if you change out their greenies, gummy bears for all their vitamins, but you say, hey, we're not doing that. We're doing real veggies. We're going to have a great salad. You'll see a positive change in their lab work. So having a whole food based diet really removes all of these problems. And then secondarily, to start thinking about the macros. And that usually comes when people are motivated to want to lose weight. That's pretty much why you would shift over to looking at that. If you have no weight to lose and you don't really have any complaints, unless something shows up in your blood work, I would say keep doing what you're doing. But most people do have to shift over and heavily low carbs, high fat, because it does improve their blood work. It does make them for a better life. But not everybody has to do it. My whole orientation now is exploring why 50% of the people who want to do keto, and we're talking about going to hospitals, we're talking about having a guide to guide them. We're talking about people who failed Virta. That's focused on primarily diabetes, but pretty much the same thing. What about the 50% that they didn't get a benefit from? And we can't just sort of say they've had diabetes longer than other people, so it's going to take a longer time to undo it. That's absolutely true. So that's not an argument. That's absolutely true. But what we can say is let's look at other things that this person is carrying in them, those invisible obstacles that I was telling you about. So some of those invisible obstacles like homocysteine, let's look at that. We can address that. Let's look at maybe intracellular nutrition levels. Are they low on B12 and folate? Some of the things we can look at that we can address. Are they low on vitamin D? That's a no-brainer. That's another thing I wanted to mention. Vitamin D, across the board, except for the one guy who was taking supplements, everybody was low on vitamin D. So these are easy wins. So if you fix somebody's homocysteine, their vitamin D, didn't even get the fish oil, except for the guy in supplements, everybody had a bad ratio of omega-3, call that to fish oil, to omega-6, call that to animal fats ratio. And so if you address that, and that would be by changing their diet, or you're going to have to do supplements if they're really going to refuse dietary change, which is a bad place to be, you can dramatically change that. And if you change that, you're going to dramatically change their inflammation. And speaking of inflammation, the marker there is, and don't be intimidated by these lab numbers and names, your CRP, is that these CRPs were between 3 as a low and 4.4 as a high. And I'm just scanning these now to make sure I'm telling you the truth. No, it's actually, the high was 6.3 and the low, if I subtract the one guy taking supplements, was 4.4. So once you change the vitamin D, the fish oil, take care of the homocysteine, you are going to drop, in a positive sense, your CRP, high sensitivity CRP, C-reactive protein, to a very comfortable level of 1 or less. That's a huge win. These are easy things to change. But you don't want to just put people on supplements for the rest of their life. You want to put people on supplements that create a positive change, that get them to the place that will let them to take it from there with a whole foods-based diet. That's where you want to end up. Not taking supplements, whole foods-based diet. They've learned to like it. They've learned where to shop it and so on and so forth. That's where you're headed. Because if somebody's on a processed food, mostly, they're on death row. They're on death row. It's fake food. And that's why we started with it. So that's it. Yeah, it's amazing. Vitamin D, the homocysteine, the inflammation, increased triglycerides, decreased HDL, elevated insulin, way out of range, glucose, not so far out of range, neutrophil, lymphocyte ratio. So that was Carl's findings on people in general, mixed genders, of over 100 pounds to lose, more or less. Pretty interesting, huh? So when I compare that to those who were immunologically challenged, came to me for other reasons, they did not have those issues. They did, so it was just, so to me, I see, again, the overweightness, the obesity incurred immunological damage, incurred, a weakened system. These are all the markers you can look at that can be changed, but this is what's happening. This is the atlas starting to crumble under the globe, under the earth he's trying to carry. So we can change that. We can change that very easily. So that's that. So I wanted to end up on a really pretty interesting note. In this passing week, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, there was a study that came out called the TRIM study. And it was referencing a pretty simple protocol. They took 10, no, I think was it 4 or 10 men, I can't remember now. And they gave them 4 things. And about 2 years later, they took their blood work, I think once every year, which means once or twice. Not very often. The study can be improved. But it took these 4 things and it reversed some of their biological aging. And what do we mean by biological aging? Well, there's various clocks, if you will. It gets pretty technical. One is methylation. Is the degree that methylation is accurate and healthy and vibrant, and you can measure this without getting into all the details. So that's a kind of clock, a methylation clock. Some people call that Horvath's. But anyway, so this is the first time ever that there's been a decrease in one's biological clock. It used to be all about telomeres and things and so on and so forth. It's beyond that. It's much bigger than that now. And so, well, that's interesting. Now, so what are these 4 things? One was human growth hormone, DHEA, metformin, vitamin D, and zinc. So that's pretty basic stuff. Very basic stuff. I don't prescribe metformin because I'm a naturopathic doctor, and I don't prescribe human growth hormone. Human growth hormone can be dangerous in anybody who has a potential or history of an immune situation, like cancer history. So you don't do that or wouldn't do that. But DHEA is common enough. And what I find is that these categories, when I look at, now I'm back to talking about these panels that I do for our clients, you look at their hormones, you look at their intracellular nutrition, is that I've come up with pretty much the same thing. So we use DHEA, we use berberine, which is sort of the naturopathic form of metformin. Some people think it's a lot better. Certainly zinc is very common. Vitamin D, you've heard me talk about that. So putting these together, it shows it doesn't have to be that complicated. They also were counseled on a basic diet, but no basic diet in particular, just, be healthier, be more whole foods oriented. That was it. It wasn't Mediterranean, it wasn't ketogenic, it wasn't vegetarian or veganism or whatever. So then, in a whole third way of comparing these things, there is an Alzheimer's panel that has evolved from when it started a couple of years ago out of Dr. Bressenden out of UCLA. And he sees Alzheimer's as a result of about 6 different reasons. Now, I'm mentioning this because this goes right along with that group of obese people in their labs that they did. So the reasons he sees Alzheimer's is generated, and that he sees and knows now that it can be improved upon, and you can pull back Alzheimer's, is because one reason is people have Alzheimer's due to inflammation, systemic and certainly cerebral, brain inflammation. The second is to, remember I said glucotoxicity, prolonged exposed levels of glucose, which means prolonged exposed levels of insulin. Absolutely. So glucose toxicity, carb toxicity, and therefore the insulin resistance. After that is what he calls atrophy. People get Alzheimer's by atrophy. Atrophy of what? His categories are hormones. So he does a hormone panel, and he looks at vitamin D. And vitamin D is low. So now you've heard vitamin D in what I talked about. You heard vitamin D in the TRIM study for anti-aging, and now you're hearing vitamin D in the Alzheimer's protocol. Let's go on to the next thing. Was, what he calls, this is now Bresendon, he calls chronic vascular issues, so / homocysteine. So he looks at homocysteine as an entire category. So remember I was saying homocysteine gums things up before the tangles get started, and exactly right. So now he sees homocysteine as a target. For one, do they have elevated homocysteine, right? And if they do, you can address that. And after that, things you can't do that much about is brain trauma. Think of an ex-football player. You can't go back in time, but if it's current trauma, you certainly can give ketones. It's a little bit of an aside. Ketones are great for fresh traumatic brain trauma. And then the last category that Bresendon has about Alzheimer's is environmental toxins. And so that would be heavy metals, parabens, pesticides, whatever you want to say, but all those things. So it's a separate category. So isn't it interesting that 4 out of 6 of these same reasons that we looked at for our group through the different panels are the same that Bresendon looks at for his Alzheimer's. And the treatment that they did for this experimental study for anti-aging is pretty much addressing the same thing, through some of their supplements. I look over there and realize there's a whole nother story I could go into about that. And maybe I will next time, and saying how because human growth hormone, if you give that, it tends to increase insulin. And so the structure of the study was he gave DHEA and metformin to bring that back down. So to decrease the insulinogenic response, so to normalize it, and then vitamin D and zinc. So interesting combination, not far from what we do. We do it slightly differently, as I mentioned. So that was today's conversation. It was a little bit high-ended. Perhaps it's probably too technical for some of you, and you're hoping that I was going to talk about bone broth or something. Bone broth is a great thing to do, and I hope you're doing it. But sometimes what I like, my sleuthing here, what I'm excited about, what I'm passionate about is like, what about that 50% that has what I call these invisible obstacles, and yet they might have the will, but it's not working for them? Just today in the Facebook group, there's a question about somebody who had gout and celiacs and why keto didn't work for them. Of course, I never got down to the nitty gritty of what he meant about keto, he or she meant about keto, and what their macros were, and so on and so forth. Usually that's the beginning of an authentic conversation. So in the more fluffy levels of, hey, it's not working, this is my issue, blah, blah, blah. But there's plenty of people that have these obstacles and they don't have the vision for it. And what I mean about the vision here, I don't mean like they don't have a bigger picture. It means they can't see their labs. They don't know enough about labs. They don't have somebody to help interpret and to show a pattern. They don't know how to interpret their hormones and say, hey, this is fixable. You're not trash yet. You haven't ruined things. You just need to pull these things back. I find that fascinating that these patterns are evolving and that they're treatable, and you can patch them back, patch them up and put them back out there and have them get excited about life again. Get that inner smaller woman, inner smaller man to come out and be their dominant self, the one who's 100 pounds less. So with that, I hope I've inspired you to some degree to think about some of these things. That's what's so exciting about the ketogenic diet is it can change lives dramatically. Some people just need more help than others. With that, have a great time. Bye-bye. Hi, this is Dr. Goldkamp. I just wanted to encourage you to send in your questions to drgoldkamp at ketonaturopath.com. Many of you have, and so what I've done with these questions that I've gotten back to most of the people I email, but some of the questions that were so good, and if they were overlapping to other questions, I would combine them and try to put that into the topic of a podcast, either via one of the micro topics that are covered in an interview. As you know, we cover a lot of topics in any given interview, or some of my own sort of reporting, if you will, on some of these issues. So please keep the questions coming. Feel free to send in an email, and I will get back to you. One thing I want to say, a number of questions have come in which I've given this answer and the email didn't work. So just make sure that you're receiving at the same email that you sent it in. And I think that might have been the difficulty. So I look forward to your questions. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that I'm open to answer your questions. And I think this world of keto is not just black and white. It's nice that it's simple, but it's not simple for some. I'm really trying to, go down as anybody, any of you who have listened to all my podcasts. We started way back when, history and evolution and epilepsy and so on and so forth. Now we're seeing some tremendous overlap in various mental disorders, such as schizophrenia or neurological disorders that are not just epilepsy. And also, just for people in losing weight, it's sometimes pretty complicated for them to engage in keto. And so they need some help. And so that's the whole point of, at least that's what I think I'm doing, is exploring the world of why are there other factors. And so in exploring some of those other factors, we've covered addiction, we've covered hormones, we've covered nutritional deficiencies, we've covered certain metabolic lab results, and we'll go further. We'll even get to more on genome and aspects. So these are all just contributions that make for an obstacle for some people to engage easily in the ketogenic diet. This is my belief, and these are the things that I've discovered. And I think other people have discovered some of these things, but not ever put them together. So stay listening, send in your questions, and I will definitely get back to you.